Welcome to the Self-Publishing Tips and Tricks Show, a series designed to give you insight into the world of self-publishing and marketing your books. Featuring your hosts, Shannon, the author behind the pen name S.C. Huston, Ben Pick, and Morgan Lee. Join us several times each month when we interview authors about their self-publishing and marketing journeys, talk to industry leaders, and discuss books about writing, self-publishing, and marketing. Hi everyone, I'm Shannon, writing under the pen name of S.C. Huston, and I'm a fantasy romance author. I write about broken characters who face adversity to become better versions of themselves, and there may or may not be a dragon, but there's always love to find. And today we are doing a book review, and I'm joined by several guests, and we're going to informally talk about Shawn Coyne's book, The Story Grid, What Good Editors Know. And we'll discuss what we've learned about the book that could apply to our author journeys and what we take away from the reading. And before we have our guests come on, just give a quick update. This episode is being recorded pretty close to the time that it's coming out. So I want to say that future episodes are going to say my Kickstarter is going or has been going, but I did not get it going. It's actually going to be pushed off until the beginning of February. So if anyone's looking for that, that's where that's at. But the pre-launch page is up for anybody who would like to go and follow it. And I'm just deep in revisions right now on that book. I thought it was not too terrible, but not that it's terrible, but I have some feedback that I need to work on with the novel, and I want to spend more time with it. So that's all that's really going on for me. And then now I'm going to introduce our guests. Please tell us who you are, what you write, anything else that you'd like to share for others to find out more about you. And we'll start with Rita.
Hi, I'm Rita SLANINA. I am an actress and author, and I post lifestyle content. I'm actually in the throes of the Amazon Prime Day deals hullabaloo that I've got wrapped into somehow. And I'm working on getting my second book in my novella series, Harbor Excursions, The Offshore Account, published. It's done, and this book that we're going to be covering today, The Story Grid, could not have come at a more perfect time, because instead of sending it out for an editor like I did with book one, we're going to do it in-house this time. So it's sort of been a learning curve and has paused the release of that. I am also currently working in a play called Don't Drink the Water in the town of Patagonia, Arizona. And I'm playing the role of Marion, and that's really fun. So we will be doing 2 more days this week, and then the show will wrap.
Can we see like clips anywhere of it?
They are filming it. They are filming it, and they're going to post it, or I'm going to, I don't know, hold someone up to get the film so that I can post it. I'm going to do something. Why not? It'd be fun. Yeah.
Hi, I'm CATHARINA Steele. I write fantasy adventure novels for both the middle grades and young adult readers. The rewrite of my debut novel, Vanishings, the Withick Mysteries series book 1, is being published by Spark Press, a hybrid publisher, on the 20th of May 2025. I also have a middle grade novella, Magical Pete, which is the origin story of Opal from the Withick Mysteries series. You can get this ebook for free when you sign up to my author newsletter, 7 at 7 with CATHARINA Steele. Hop over to my website, www.catharinesteele.com. Wait for a few seconds, and a pop-up window with the form will appear. I also have a Kickstarter that is starting up on the 14th of October, and the what's it called again? The
Pre-launch page.
Yes, thank you. The pre-launch page is up already.
Okay, well, make sure you give us all your links, and I'll put that in the description box and show notes.
Cool, thank you.
I guess I'm next up. Hello, fellow authors. Hello. This is Adetokunbo Adeshile, writing under the pen name A. Adeshile. I tell stories for fun and profit, pretty much. So I write in the genres of fantasy, urban fantasy, and just a little bit of romance. You can find me on ADESHILEwrites.com, which is my website. And right now I am working on a Fury Tale, which is a nice little urban fantasy story. So that's just about it for me.
So we all have a little bit of fantasy, except for Rita. But Rita, are you part of the Bog Hag anthology?
I am. Yes.
So you're writing fantasy for that, right?
I am. Yeah. I feel like compared to the other submissions, mine's going to be kind of like, I don't know, middle school-esque.
Is that your first story in fantasy, first time writing in fantasy?
Probably to this extent, considering I've never heard of the term bog hag or swamp witch before.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole.
Right.
But yeah, it was fun to do that, and I had a good time doing it. But I did get that submission, and I'm excited to see that. I think that comes out soon.
Well, the submission deadline is October 15th. So the date this comes out is the submission deadline. I really, I have a story. The story that you and I started on your stream when I came on, was that Friday morning? Yeah, a couple Fridays ago.
Friday? I think it's Friday.
And we were like going back and forth with the ideas for it.
Yes.
I was like, so I got an idea, but I just don't know if I'm gonna have time to write it. But yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna have time to write it. I don't know when she can publish it.
I want to say she's going to do it right before Halloween.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
So, alrighty, well, let's get into Shawn Coyne's book, The Story Grid. And even though this book has been published since 2015, I just started hearing it come up in like talks and podcasts this year, and it came up quite a few times. And then when I looked into it, it intrigued me. So I like to start with the book's description. What is the Story Grid? The Story Grid is a tool developed by editor Shawn Coyne to analyze stories and provide helpful editorial comments. It's like a CT scan that takes a photo of the global story and tells the editor or writer what is working, what is not, and what must be done to make what works better and fix what's not. The Story Grid breaks down the component parts of stories to identify the problems, and finding the problems in a story is almost as difficult as the writing of the story itself, maybe even more difficult. Story Grid is a tool with many applications. One, it will tell a writer if the story works or doesn't work. Two, it pinpoints story problems, but does not emotionally abuse the writer, revealing exactly where a story, not the person creating the story has failed. So there's emphasis on the story there. Number three, it will tell the writer the specific work necessary to fix the story's problem. Four, it is a tool to re-envision and resuscitate a seemingly irredeemable pile of paper stuck in an attic drawer. And five, it is a tool that can inspire an original creation. So now what I like to ask, and I kind of tell you guys first my thoughts and opinions, but then I'm going to ask you guys if you can add to it, is whether or not you think this book description delivers on the promise that's in the book description. Did the book itself deliver on it? And my thoughts on that is that Story Grid does seem to be a powerful tool for analyzing stories. And in that sense, to me, it partially delivers on the promise. There's an emphasis on genre conventions, obligatory scenes, and value shifts that provides a helpful framework for identifying structural elements and potential issues. However, to say that the Story Grid pinpoints story problems and it reveals exactly where a story has failed, I think that's kind of overselling it just a bit, because the book provides a method. It's a way of thinking about the narrative structure, but it doesn't like magically diagnose every flaw. And he does stress this is just a tool. But if you don't know how to look at what it's giving you, the data it's giving you, then you're not going to know and be able to pinpoint where the story is failing. So I don't think it doesn't really help in fixing all of those or helping you find those things to fix. The onus is still on the writer to interpret the information from the story grid, what's revealed during the story grid, and determine the best course of action. And I found the steps leading up to the creation of the story grid itself. So the story grid is like this big, huge thing that you would create at the very end, but there's several smaller parts that you would fill out, create, put together before you get to that part. So those steps leading up to the story grid, like analyzing the genre, examining scenes, etc., those I think are incredibly valued by themselves, and they force me to engage with my story on a deeper level. But I felt like the final visual representation of the story grid, it just felt like a lot of information and work that I felt like I could use my time better elsewhere. I didn't look at that big, huge story grid and think, yeah, I can see exactly what I need to do from looking at this. That was not clear to me, like looking at what was in the book there. I was like, everything I did leading up to that point, that would have helped me. So for me, the true value of the story grid lies in its ability to shift your perspective on storytelling. And it's a tool for asking the right questions, not necessarily providing all of the answers. All right. I know that was kind of a long thing. I had a lot to say. What do you guys feel? Did the description deliver on what you've read from the book?
I think as far as breaking down, like you were saying, just to do, if you do this part in this area, this part in that area, that was helpful. But when I look at even this page, I'm going to show here the Foolscap Global Story Grid, which is kind of like a lined piece of paper with a bunch of sections on it. Inciting, incident, complication, crisis, climax, resolution, throughout story from beginning to end. It kind of starts getting confusing for me, and with all the grids and all the things that you would have to learn to apply these steps. So that's where I started getting like stressed out.
I mean, and there are names given to things that some of it we know as writers, like inciting incident makes sense. But then sequence is not a word that we usually use in the writing world. So I was like, okay, what's a sequence? I know a sequel.
That's more film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I did kind of thought, I thought it's probably coming from his background in film, but for like a book writer, a novelist, they're not going to know probably what a sequence is. So it's not that you can't figure it out. But if you're trying to learn what these scenes are, and he's talking about how to use them, well, you have to first stop and learn what this is exactly so that you can understand how to use it.
Right. So that goes to your other point where it's like you have to learn a whole new vernacular in the book to learn what he does as a good editor. So you've got a whole new class to do. I think overall it's a great book. I learned things I hadn't known before of how an editor looks at a book, and it made me look at my final draft on book 2 a little bit more without the rose-colored lenses. Really,
you're looking at it as an editor instead of the writer, which is what he was telling us over and over
which
again.
I love that he reminds us to do that. Is, hey, check out of the emotional attachment you have to this, and which I mean we should do anyway. But somehow the way he said it spoke to me. So.
So I agree with all of everything that everyone said. I think that some people are going to hit a wall because of the amount of work involved in doing this. You're talking weeks of work, and a lot of people I think will just, that's just too much. I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to get an editor to do it. But I think that because I had already kind of developed an Excel worksheet for myself before I read this book, where I did have the scenes, the time, the word count, and a lot of the stuff that he actually has in there. So I had already been doing it. So for me, it was kind of like an affirmation of what I was doing already. And then there was like some things that I hadn't been doing. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. I didn't think of that. So I found it, I think, because I'd already kind of been doing it. So it was easier for me to then take it in what he was talking about and to, just develop what I was doing more. But I also understand how much work it would be. And for some people, this tool will just overwhelm them and it could actually stop them from writing the book. So I think you've got to think about, is this tool right for you and what works best for you?
So I have lots of thoughts about this book here. I'm in agreement with a number of things that everyone has said. It is a bit dense. You are having to learn a whole nother lexicon. It's sort of like learning, it reminds me of learning grammar and then fixing your prose with the grammar. But to learn grammar, you have to learn each of the individual pieces, like what is a noun, what is a verb, but while you're also building or fixing your story. So you're doing 2 times the work, which for people, if they're about to write a story and they're looking at this, I agree, it might slow you up. But he does mention later in the book that it's a good tool. It's an editing tool. So get your writing out there and then come back and use this tool. So for me, I felt like this book actually did a good job at hitting on a number of its points. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later on, but I definitely felt like I could review different parts of my story without beating myself up. Which was pretty huge. It took me some reading to get into that to really figure out where, but I thought that was great. I felt a number of his concepts that he used were wonderful, like the idea of the obligatory scenes and a knock-knock joke and conventions. That was like mind change. I was like, this makes a lot of sense here. I like this. As a person who's also an intuitive writer, I did have a little bit of dissonance until the end where it's like, use this at the end. I was like, okay. But some of the things that he mentions, like the fool's cap, are things I can do as I am doing my reverse outline. So like I might write a chapter or scene and then write a sentence or two. And then using his structure, I have a neat place to put it. And so also the story grid itself, if it's different sections, given that I look at each section or chapter when I'm done, it's not as bad for me to plug and play. But I would agree, as everyone else said, if I just came from it looking at the larger grid, it would be a problem. And the language is a little bit challenging. So there is a lot of upfront work you have to do to learn the material, to execute it. but I think it can be valuable if you feel as though your story's not working.
So I like to touch on that for a minute with something you said, ADESHILE. So CATHARINA and we were backstage for a little bit talking, and that's when she told me that she kind of already does a lot of this stuff already. She has a spreadsheet that she keeps everything in. And I was like, I do too, because I do reverse outlines. So you said in my reverse outline, I had the setting, the point of view character, the characters in the chapter, the unnamed characters in the chapter, the characters that are mentioned but are not in the chapter. I have a paragraph that's a summary of the chapter, and then I also have the date and time. I have all of that in there, which is a lot of the stuff that he talks about putting together for the spread Excel sheet later that he talks about in the book, that leads up to the story grid. And it's called a Story Grid Spreadsheet, I think. So I'm curious, what do you put into your reverse outline, ADESHILE?
So I borrowed a lot from Dean Wesley Smith. Are you all familiar with him?
I don't know what he's suggested, but I'm familiar.
Okay. Dean Wesley Smith, he wrote a book called Writing to the Dark. He's been on 20 Books to 50K a number of times, talking about writers just need to get out there and write. He's an old school guy, very prolific. He's written hundreds of stories, literally. And some of them are things like stories from X-Men, from Men in Black, and a number of other things. So he has his chops, and he likes to keep things very simple. He's old school. So the Fool's Cat page would work for him. His idea is you should be able to keep everything in one page. So I take from him. He's like, write a sentence that's a summary of everything there, what the people are wearing, the location, the POV, and keep it moving. And that, for the most part, is what I keep to. And there might be a hook that I need to remember for the future that I might put that down. But in the general, I keep it a simple sentence or two if I can. I'm a little wordy, as you might be able to tell. So it might be 3 sentences, but I try to keep it condensed.
What is the story grid, and how does Shawn Coyne propose it changes the way we approach editing?
Well, I feel like we kind of touched on that a little bit, right? Because he doesn't want to abuse the writer. He wants us to get outside of, I'm an intuitive writer as well, so I understand that approach. But and being able to separate ourselves from the feelings of what that can be. So I think he kind of does a good job of saying, hey, it's not personal. This is about this creation you've made. It's already amazing, but let's make it better. He doesn't want anyone to feel like, but there's a lot of information. And that's kind of where I was just feeling a little stressed personally, because I was reading this a lot slower than I read other books. I'll just say it like that.
Agreed.
Same thing. I was reading. I was like, what? Wait, let me start. I think it's his diction. His diction is a little bit, I would say it's above the 8th grade level. Most things are written at the 8th grade level. His diction is definitely higher. So
yeah,
I would say I found it very compact. Like the way he writes, there's so much information in every single sentence. So we're taking in a lot of information, and that slows you down because it's kind of like, whoa, but I found, like, the one thing I'll say about the story grid is that, we're talking about putting on our editor's hats, and it helps you to kind of look at a particular scene and say, is this scene working? Do I need this scene? What in this scene do I really need? And could I shift that elsewhere and pull that scene all together? And as a writer, it can be really hard to look at a scene basically very clinically and say, is this scene working for me, and to delete something they've written. It's their baby. But sometimes you do have to do that. You have to say, this scene's slowing the story down, and there's only a couple of bits in here that are really important. And I can actually include that over here and this bit over here. And this bit, actually, that's more for me as the writer that I need to know, but the reader doesn't really need to know that. So I can pull that out. And I think the story grid is kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, challenging the writer to really think about what they're including in every single scene and the scenes that they are including as a whole in the story, to keep that movement forward, to keep that tension high or increase that tension throughout the story. And something for me that I struggled with when I started was tension, because I avoid it in my life. So that came through my writing. So I think, as a writer, it sort of helps you to see the areas that you need to work on yourself, and helps you to realistically look at that and improve as a writer.
I agree. So I really appreciated his notion of story and genre, story being about change and genre being about that ascending and descending the Maslow hierarchy of needs, and the change being how close and how far we're going from that. That really helped a lot. And it really, I think, set the stage for what he called the 5 commandments. I think it was the inciting incident, right? The progressing complication, I think was one.
Yeah, crisis climax resolution.
Okay, thank you. Those elements there, and saying that those are essentially the DNA of the scenes or of the series or the section. To me, that was the section that kind of opened it up, saying, "Hey, this isn't about you, writer. You like what you wrote is fine. We might need to do some tweaks, but this is what drives the story. This is what makes the story come alive. So maybe you just didn't make your character make a choice, or maybe you mixed that climactic question that they had to make a decision on. Like, oh, well, knowing that, now that I can look at my scene or sections or what have you, I can check for that. So that made it much less, can I write? Do I write well? Am I any good? What am I doing? Right? It takes it much more like, no, it's a problem, as he said, but I'm not the problem. It's just looking at how are things laid out. What are the specs? I think another example he used was like, this is just your layout. I was like, that makes sense. If this is a layout for a house, where's my bathroom at? Did I forget to put a bathroom in the house? Well, that might be a problem, right? Like, we all have issues here. So let me go back in and put that in. We're going to have 2 bathrooms. How about that? Great.
I love that.
That's gonna be the catchphrase of this episode. Come figure out what you need to do.
I really did appreciate that. And Shane, I think you said it, like his general conversation about genre and those other elements were just really good for me to understand as a writer in general. Like having that and then just putting it to the side when I go to write, not hyper focusing on, but just having my background. This is something that Dean Wesley Smith says, learn something and then just go and do stuff. I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah. I mean, especially like the obligatory scenes he talks about by genre. That is something because I'm also intuitive writer as well. But I think a lot of stuff in my head for a long time. And I always know my endings. I always know my beginnings of my stories. And to my series, I know the beginnings and endings to my series as well. The middle part, I never know. But what I try to do to prepare myself is to think about those obligatory scenes. Like there has to be the meet cute because I write fantasy romance. There's a meet cute. And there's also the hero's quest. So like when does the journey, when does the quest get given to the person? So I think about those things and how that's going to come into the story. Sometimes I write it down. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I write it down. Sometimes I don't. The reason why I sometimes do and sometimes don't, because usually when I write it down, that's not what happens. So, but yeah.
Not the truth.
I think another thing that I thought that and this was part of the foolscap page that he was talking about, where you have the 6 key questions. And he said almost any editor who's going to read a book is always going to ask these 6 key questions. And I don't remember them off the top of my head. I know there's several times in the book. So what is
your genre? What's your POV?
And then the theme and controlling idea, which I have some to say with that on another question that we have. Thinking about that, I think those questions would be useful to have before you first start writing. If you have an idea, you can kind of fill it in. Now, as far as theme, I never really know, except for one book I've written. That was my most recent one for my Kickstarter. I knew what controlling theme and idea was going to be in that book, but this book I'm writing, I'm like, I have no idea. But
He does mention that oftentimes we don't really know until after. I forget what author he was or screenplay writer he was talking about. It was like, you could ask this person, like, I didn't write any themes in there. It just wrote an entertaining story. It's like, okay. But even I've started to notice as an intuitive writer, I just write. There's some themes that I know I'm putting in, but as I finish things or people talk to me about them, like, oh, I didn't realize that theme is in there. Like, okay.
Is that the Silence of the Lambs part where he was doing the story grid for the Silence of the Lambs, and he had interviewed him or the writer of that? And was that the one where he said that? He's like, I just wrote it. I didn't know there was a theme.
Right. I think it might have been someone else, but yeah, that's what he said. The guy would argue that he had no theme.
Yeah.
I think that's where like your beta and alpha readers really come in handy, because they'll say, oh, this is what's happening. And then I'm like, oh, I did that. Okay, let me go like play that out some more.
Yeah.
Subconscious.
had that happen a few times.
I like to I do like this mind dump of the story that's in my head, and I don't like to think about anything. I just like to get a feel for the characters, for the story, and then I go and look at it, and I'm like, okay, there's actually a theme there, and and this is what this character's like, and then I can start thinking more closely about the scenes that should be in the story and stuff like that. But I like to do that exploratory writing first, because it's much more natural way to write, I think, and I think that affects the story and the quality of the story. And it's otherwise it can become a bit too mechanical, and that I think the reader feels that.
Yeah.
It brings up an interesting concept. Where do stories come from? I think, at least for me as an intuitive writer, I think that as I look at my work, my life experiences are what end up impacting the story. And I've had a conversation with a friend very recently about this, like, why do you write? He calls it, I think, sort of like a soul craft, or something to that. It's like, as I look at my work, it's like all my experiences, even though I'm putting different characters in, and even though I may not be thinking about a particular theme, is like everything that I have experienced is still going into to the birth of this story, right? To the labor of this story. It's still going in there. So the story comes out like a kid, right? The story comes out looking somewhat like me in one way or the other. So I think that might have an impact on the themes that come out. I don't know, but
I agree with you. It's so funny you said you just had a friend who asked you that. I just had a friend ask me in the last week, why do you write? I had just been thinking about it. And so my thing that I say is I write about broken characters who face adversity to become better versions of themselves. I'm like, well, I used to be a broken character, and I figured out this life thing and become a better version of myself. So I think that's why I write about broken characters who become better versions of themselves, and so all my characters are broken in some way. Now, they don't all have my trauma, but they all have trauma. So.
Yeah.
Well, and that's another thing. So that I think his name is Shawn says in there that these stories end up being kind of maps to help other people out.
Mm-hmm.
So I've heard that from him. I've heard that from, what's this guy's name? John Truby. Right now I'm showing a book called
yes.
The Anatomy of Genres, John Truby.
I have that book, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I want to read it.
It might be a good follow-up. I think they should be in conversation, because he talks about the themes that come with genre, like genres as philosophies as well. So there's a lot of back and forth I can see between those two things. But in there, he talks about the importance of stories giving meaning and purpose. So I've heard several authors bring that up. And so I was going to ask you, like, oh, you got this life thing figured out? Like, teach me. I was like, oh, I can read your book. There we go. That's what I can do. That's the map.
I mean, I can't say I have it all figured out, but I figured out how to be happy. So I don't live in negativity. I try to stay in positivity.
Oh, yeah. I had a question for you guys on the genre 5-leaf clover thing. 4-leaf, 5-leaf
5-leaf clover. Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a big graphic.
It is a big infographic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You got the book.
Oh, yeah. Because I don't remember. You guys will say something and I'll go, I don't remember.
Oh, wow.
I would say that too, for those who do not have the actual physical book. If you get the ebook, I could barely, because I also have the ebook. I got that free from a Kickstarter I was part of. So I could barely see the graphics on the ebook. So if you really want to be able to see the graphics, get the actual book.
I actually found with the ebook you can actually click on the graphic and blow it up.
But I have a book funnel app.
I also went and downloaded. You can get the images online and download them.
Rita, I'm so sorry I interrupted you.
Oh, you're fine. No, go where the conversation flows. I don't mind. It's all I was going to ask was, so I was actually caught by surprise on how many different genres there are.
Oh.
I did not know that. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh, there's romance, romantic fantasy, there's thriller, there's horror fantasy, there's, dark literature, there's whatever. But I didn't realize there was style genre. I didn't realize there was like structure, which when you see what it says, mini plot, arch plot, anti-plot. Okay, well, I get that. But I never would have put it into a genre. So how he coupled everything into this flower, I don't know, it just seemed like a lot of information. I just went, oh, that's a genre. I just felt kind of like thrown like into awe going, huh.
I agree. Like I forget what it was under. It might be style. I don't know. But part of it was dance was a subset.
It's
And
under
that
style.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that was the example used was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and I was thought about. I was like, that makes perfect sense. I
Yeah.
never would have thought of that, but you're right. That is dance. It is. I mean, it's visual. Yeah, it's visual dance, but it is dance.
Never would have in a million years thought that that could be put into a genre section of something. I just didn't think of it that way. If it's dance, I'm thinking, oh, it's just a theater, or it's
Yeah.
creative movement, or it's modern dance, or whatever it is, right? Or like theatrical, literary. Like I wouldn't have put those in the same flower leaf because I wouldn't have thought those were similar. But in this book, he goes into why they're similar, and I just thought that was interesting. Wouldn't have thought of connected those dots.
I definitely found the whole genre aspect of the story really eye-opening, and it just made me really think about my own stories and which genres they really do fit in. Is it really a mystery, or is it simply action adventure set in a fantasy subgenre?
Right.
And I kind of went, oh, and then with, as you guys have already talked about, with the different the genres regarding structure and everything, I had just not really thought about it in that like that. I'm not finding the right word, but I just hadn't thought about it. Thank you. I just hadn't thought about it in that context before, and I was just kind of like, that actually really clarifies things so well that it becomes less airy-fairy and much more applicable.
Right.
I agree. It makes me, it's a lot of work to digest the information. It does make me excited in some ways as a writer because I'm like, oh, really? Really? And all those random conversations I have in back in my brain about, find your target audience or this, that, and the other. It's like, well, yes, there's that. But like now I'm open to have more freedom in choosing like what story I want to have, like consciously choosing. Like I always
Not
have
so
choice.
locked in.
Right.
Yes.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
felt
You
that
said it.
freedom a bit with this too.
Yes.
I felt more stressed before I read it, even though it's stressful to read.
It's a lot to take in.
I felt like I was climbing that rock. And I'm just like, I don't want to do this anymore. But then you go to the end, you just get, like you said, ADESHILE, it was like at the end, it brought it all together.
Yeah.
It brought it all together where you're kind of like, oh, I get it.
The payoff is what he said.
Yes. But I have to say, when I saw that last graphic in there was no payoff for me. I was like, what? I was like, we did all this work to make this thing that like makes no sense to me. It doesn't. I look at it, it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I understand the valence, the positivity, the negativity, but I'm like, how do you look at that and something jumps out at you to say this works or this doesn't work? I'm not looking at it and seeing that happening. Because I'm like, wait, if you're like really, really, really positive at the end of the story, is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you're really, really negative, I don't understand. How do I take that information and translate it into something that I can understand to use it to work for me? I couldn't. The final story grid, the whole story grid thing, I didn't understand that. But I mean, it could be just me.
I have an idea because if I have okay, so here's a folder of stuff, right? I don't know what the heck's in here. It's like there's nothing in here. So I get what you're saying. Oh, I did all this work, but now it's just in here. What do I do with it? Put it on a wall, blow it up, make it big. I do like a reverse storyboard. So I'll write the story and then I'll write on notes, like index cards, and then slap them up in my quadrants or whatever acts, however many acts I have in my chapters that correspond after it's written. So in my brain, because I'm very visual, I thought, okay, I'll just make this grid and put it up on the wall and get markers. And this way I can see it after writing it down. It won't be hidden away. That was the only way I thought it would.
I feel like that doing the spreadsheet is going to give me all the information I need to know about my book. So why do I need to go make this grid out of it? What is this grid giving me that I'm not getting from doing the process up to the grid?
And I think that's where everyone's quite unique, and what works for each of us is going to be different, and I think it's how your brain works.
Mm-hmm.
Like what makes sense for you to do that, do it that way. Use of the tools that, Shawn provides in this story grid. Use what works for you. But if this bit doesn't work for you, doesn't make sense to you, don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it. Agreed.
Yeah.
But if parts of it you could take away from it,
Yeah.
Shannon, what would you say was something you could take away from it and maybe apply?
Yes. So what I felt like would probably really work is that, well, one, it did affirm like my belief in what I was already doing with my reverse outline. So what I took away is that if you really do dig in there the way he's talking, so I kind of do a lot of this stuff already, but I don't get as deep as he does. So if I can get in there and get in there really deep and really learn, like I know some of the tropes in my genre, I know some of the obligatory scenes, but what if I'm missing something? Let me dig deeper in there and look at it. Because once you do understand all that, what he says is you can subvert them strategically. And that creates surprises while delivering a satisfying reading experience. So that's what I really take away. What about you guys?
Definitely the genres and that kind of breakdown, the arch plot versus the internal plot, and just the pairing them together. I will say I felt a little bad at first when he talked about the internal plots because I think that's mostly what I write from, which is a little supposedly literary. I'm like, oh, that's not good because I need commercial. So I had mixed feelings about that. I still do. But, he said that the best stories are a mixture of the two. And given the genres and how I can approach it, then it's fine. But that was a little like, oh, I appreciate knowing the difference of those and all the genres that he set up. And once again, the idea of the knock-knock joke and the obligatory scenes, and then the five commandments, as he says. Those were some really big takeaways. The other thing I was going to say was I also thought the idea how he connected the genres to Maslow and those values, and then looking at that value change, I think it's a bit complicated. Like, I don't know, it might take me some work to explore, but I did appreciate that. I think about one of my characters right now. I think he might be on that disillusionment spectrum or something like that. But having that idea of like binarily, we have like, let's say, was it justice, injustice, and then how he talked about like, well, one of these is just unfair, and then the extreme of this is tyranny. Like for me, that might be a little bit hard as I try to replicate that for different things just to figure it out. But I thought that was very useful for me because now if that is what's connected to the genre, and I'm trying to give a lot of oomph to what I'm doing, I can kind of track where I'm going, where the characters are going on that progression. So still, once again, because the book is a little deep, a little complicated, it might be hard for me. Maybe not. Maybe it just come to me, but it's something I definitely got from the material as well.
I think we're all right there with you. So.
Yeah, I felt like I learned like what you were saying about the internal and external is that conflict. That was something I learned. I actually never knew that. Like as an actor, I understand internal conflict and how it relates to the other people in a scene. But as a writer, just didn't even occur to me. I just didn't put two and two together. And then as soon as I read that part, I was watching a movie and I went, internal conflict. Oh, that's external conflict. Like now I'm like able to see it for what it was. So that was a takeaway for me for sure. And then the genre thing, that got me stuck. Like the many genres inside the genres.
So I've done, I've been using internal conflict for almost everything I write because of the fact that my characters are broken. So they have their own litany that's going through their head, like they're not good enough or whatever is happening because of their trauma. So they always have a lie that they believe about themselves that they have to overcome. And so that I've always had. But when he was in that section, he was talking about the internal and the external conflict. I felt like I reread it several times. I thought, well, maybe I'll ask you guys, see if you got something different from it, if you remember this part. He says that the stories, I wrote this down. He says the stories that are most compelling require a sense of irony, in which the external and internal story arcs have opposite polarities.
Oh, yeah.
What that means is like, he uses, I wrote my own example here. A hero succeeds externally by like getting the quest is to get a sword. He succeeds in getting his sword, but in order to get the sword internally, his internal conflict was that he has to sacrifice like his love. And so he sacrifices his love. So he's losing on one end and winning on the other end. And he says, those are the most compelling stories. And I'm like, I felt like that he was saying that is like, that's fact. That's the most compelling. And I'm like, I write romance. In romance, you can't have a positive and negative external and internal story because it doesn't jive,
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, but love stories are very impactful. So I just didn't understand it. So I didn't know if you guys got something else from that, or did you also understand that he was saying that those are the best stories when you have opposite polarities?
I think you've got to think about what his main genre is, being the murder mystery thriller.
Yeah.
And in that environment, you can see very much that is definitely the case.
Yeah.
But like you said, romance, that isn't going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And you could perhaps put that down to that's not really his expertise area. But maybe there is something that, relationships, there's always a little bit of give and take in a relationship to make it work. So perhaps in applying that concept, you could say that the person's had to realise this thing that they believe about themselves is actually going to hurt the relationship, and they've got to somehow figure out how to let go of that or something like that.
But by the end of the story, they have to learn how to let go of it, so they're still ending positive. Because if they don't let go, the relationship doesn't work.
But that way they're still losing something. So you've got that kind of you're kind of applying it.
They're losing what they used to believe in.
Yeah, kind of letting go of something that this belief that they had, kind of letting go of that in order to get something better.
That's positive.
But they're still letting go of something to gain positive.
That does go back to where he said that any change, no matter how small, requires loss, and the prospect of loss is far more powerful than potential gain. Even positive change results in loss.
Yes,
but it's still, I don't think it would go along with what he's saying, because it's just, you just have the one external thing, you have the one internal thing, and you're supposed to, those should be opposite by the end of the story. I don't know that small changes, or I don't know.
You could still say that he's had to lose something, or he or she's had to lose something to gain something. So, there's an internal belief that they have to let go of to gain the physical effect of the relationship.
I think I'm going to go with your first answer, which is that this is not his genre.
I get you, Shan. It is a little hard to suss out. And Katharina, I think I'm tracking with what you're saying here. That's what I hope it is. That's what I hope it is. Your second response, but if not, I probably will say, well, your first response is true. It's like, well, he is primarily coming from thrillers, and so that dichotomy is a potentiality. So I don't know. Maybe it's worth sending him an email. Like, maybe just ask him, bring him on. Like, hey,
you could have just.
It's in my fantasy series. My fantasy series, the whole thing really is about Lily. From the very beginning, she's trying to save her sister. She lost one already. Then she gets that sister back, and at the end she loses that. So her whole thing is get my family back together. In the end, her family's still torn apart, but she's in a better place in her life. So it's like, it's a bittersweet ending. So I was like, okay, in a way she found her love, so that's positive, but on the negative side, she wasn't able to keep her family together like she wanted.
That works.
Yeah, but that's not romance. There's romance in it, but it's romance in it. Yeah,
but I think that's the point. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be related, does it? Like, the thing that they're losing doesn't have to relate to the thing
So that's what I was wondering. Like, maybe he used that example just to get you to think about the differences in the example, not necessarily one is the other or positive is a negative in that same sentence. I don't know. I feel like even talking about it starts to confuse me. So
the part that got me was that he said the most compelling stories have that negative. It has that irony, which you get the irony from having the negative at the end, or you have the not negative, sorry, the opposite. And I was like, how's that the most compelling? Sure, I can understand it for a thriller. It's probably most compelling.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I do wonder how much it speaks from his category, being thriller, or how much from his worldview. Because even me, because I can have my own challenges, like, well, maybe because it's very realistic, but it's like, no, sometimes life does just have happy endings. Like, there are just happy ending, like, stints of time. So I don't know. I agree. I think that's a problematic, that's a statement worth analyzing, talking to.
I'm going to pull it back to genre expectations. And genre expectations when it comes to romance is the happy ever after? Yeah. Is that everything's so good? And as ADESHILE, did I say that right?
ADESHILE.
sometimes it is all good, and life does actually work out that way. So I think, Shannon, you're right. When it comes to a romance story, I don't know that particular aspect fits.
Yeah. Well, we are coming close to the end of our time. I'd like to ask one more question before we go into the last question. Did the book change how you think about story structure or the editing process, and in what ways? And so I guess maybe what I'm trying to get into is like, what about story structure and your editing process do you think you'll take away and use from this book?
Well, I would say it didn't change how I think about story structure directly. I would say indirectly, it's given me things to think about, but it's not necessarily going to have me do something fully different. That's one thing. As far as the editing process goes, I've not edited a book before. So this kind of gave me more confidence to do so. And I'll go back to the thing he says, just trying to sell you on getting the book, is it's not to beat up the writer. And so that kind of resonated with me. So I could go, you know what, I can do this without, being mean to myself.
Right.
Yeah. So, it's given me confidence to want to edit and go at it kind of proactively in a logical way, take out the emotion and not say, hey, I'm a bad writer. I just need to fix some things, and that's okay. So
I think my biggest thing that I will take from it is that it's a bit of a challenge, like how well can I edit my books, with this new, better, more deeper understanding I have of different elements of writing a story. And there's that, just kind of also brought to mind is to break a rule, you first need to become good at following it and have a clear understanding of how that rule works to be able to break it. So those people who, he talks about this writer who just didn't want to include this obligatory scene in the story, and the story just wasn't working. And I think what this writer wasn't understanding is that you first need to really understand the rule before you decide you're going to break it, because if you're going to break it, the story still needs to work without it. So that's, probably one of my big takeaways.
There's so much I've taken away from this. I'm very glad he did write this book. I am an intuitive writer mostly. I'm usually in the camp of Dean Wesley Smith. I read a lot of his works about writing. He's not much for doing the whole editing thing. He's about you cycle through, you go back every 500 words, you fix your little nits here in your creative voice, not being critical on yourself. You keep the story going, look your reverse outline, take things out that where you've gone too much, and then send it, because your editorial skills don't necessarily match your understanding, your natural innate understanding of story. That said, I feel like this gives me some tools and explains why sometimes when people go back to edit, they may mess up a living piece of work, right? Editors do no harm, right? It now makes sense because they may take out something that's very critical to the story. There was an example where he was talking about The Great Gatsby and how the narrator used the word something of a clan or somewhat of a clan or whatever is what he said of nobles or whatever. But a strict grammar read might cut that word out, and then it changes the whole conflict, crisis, everything of it. You miss something very important. So all that said is, I think I will take away that I can now see if something in general, something works. Like, does it do these elements turn the value of the story over? Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be a great story, but it doesn't mean it will work. And I am particular about that because a knock-knock joke is a type of joke with particular obligatory statements and the conventions of the wordplay, but that doesn't mean you're going to laugh. Like, the joke works. I can't just say knock. And you're all right. That doesn't work, right? That doesn't work. But knock, knock, oh. And then the wordplay. It still may not come out right, but I, as a writer, can feel like, hey, this worked. Now, how great it'll be, we'll have to see on how I've written it. So I feel like I've taken that from the story, being able to go back and kind of look in general at pieces.
Yeah. And for me, it was when he was talking about what he calls a turn, which I kind of just equate to conflict. So he talked about how every scene should have a turn, whether it's internal or external. And again, I think of this as conflict. And I feel like I have that in my scenes. But how he breaks it down is that a turn happens. It's driven either by a character action or by a revelation, which I think that could be really hard. The character action is very easy to see, but revelation is like what you were just saying, ADESHILE, like if that one piece of that one word was taken out, no revelation would be coming from that, because that one word made it sound like, well, it's not really a clan, like he doesn't consider himself part of being that noble family. So without having that in there, there's no revelation that comes from it. So, now that I have this idea that it's not just action, revelation also works, I think that would make me feel better, because I feel like that, I have scenes that are just kind of somewhat talking, there's things happening. I'm like, but I feel like this is doing something for the scene. Like there's information being told here, but I always felt like, well, it's wrong to have this because there's no action, especially when it comes to fantasy, right? Fantasy's lots of action. So I think this is going to help me be able to look at, and I'm in the process of editing my book right now. So once I get all this beta reader feedback and get it in there, then I'll be able to use this. And that's something I'm definitely going to use, is looking at that character conflict by character action or revelation. So.
Nice.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our questions, us talking about the book. We do have just one more, which is all in the name of the podcast, is self-publishing tips or tricks. So with this last question, what is the best tip or trick you learned from Shawn Coyne's book, The Story Grid?
Oh.
As she grabs the book, like, oh, hold on. Oh goodness. I feel that, Rita. I feel that.
There's a lot in here. There's a lot.
If I had to select one personally, I would say knowing the importance of the expected scenes for a genre.
The obligatory scenes.
Yeah. So, because if a reader's not going to know what exactly is missing in the book, they're going to know something that's missing, and it's not going to hit it for them. So, if you're not including those obligatory scenes, then that's going to be reflected in how they feel about the book, and therefore the rating they're going to give the book. And so, I think that for me, that was like, yeah, I do. That's a good one to think about, that, because that has a big commercial impact on the book, I think, personally.
I just wish you would tell us what all the obligatory scenes are supposed to be for all the genres.
Say that.
Yes.
Well, I just wish he would give us all the obligatory scenes for all of the genres.
Yes.
There was a guessing game there, right? A little bit.
I wish he did that. Now, I did download Excel sheet, and the Excel sheet, I forget, Story Grid, the Story Grid Excel sheet. I forget. Maybe that's the name of it. But I think it does allow you to pull down. I don't know, but I put in Thriller, and I could see some of the convention obligatory scenes. So
he gives the Thriller ones in the book.
Yeah. And then I think I went to some just action and had different ones that popped up. So we might have some access, even if we didn't lay it in the book. Maybe.
I'm gonna go check that out now. Yes, I did download that sheet.
Yeah, I downloaded that and something from his website. So it's in one of those.
So the tip I would take away from the book that he says is watch for lazy editors.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be the one thing I would tell people, is because I like how he lets you know, like in the big publishing houses, he didn't want to call them lazy. It's just the only word he said he could come up with. But it was this, they're so busy and it's so manufactured, like this commercial wheel, right? That they don't have time and they're not really paying attention. They're not even reading half the books that they edit. And if you're lucky, if they edit it at all, and they just like maybe put one red line and send it in and it's over and it goes out anyway. So watch for lazy editors. That's the tip.
Rita, I am so glad you said that. I almost forgot, because that was one of the first things I took from the book, was like, hey, indie writers or people that are worried about going indie because they might be judged, note that your book may not even be actually being read, or you could write a fantastic book, but because other popular authors have already written, these companies aren't going to buy your work. Sorry, nothing against you. You walk away, oh, my book is terrible. Like, no, that was just supply and demand. They had too many. Sorry.
Yeah.
But that which sounds terrible, but like that, yeah, thank you so much.
It was eye-opening.
Yes.
I've heard that before, but I like that he did put that in the book. So for anyone who may not know exactly what we're talking about, he spends a part of the book talking about the trad space and how literary agents and editors go about acquiring books. And so, yeah, if there's a whole bunch of thriller novels coming through and they've already bought a couple, they're not going to buy another one, even if it's better than all the ones they bought already.
Well, and he was also talking about, the editors sort of have that prediction of what's going to be it this season, and they're going to be taking, a lot more manuscripts that are going to hit that particular expectation that they have, right or wrong. So it's just
for their little magic formula, and that's it, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, so obligatory scenes are already mentioned, so I will just go back to the notion that these genres, these stories are about fundamental human values and needs, and we watch that story change based on that and use the 5 commandments to help make sure your story spins. So feel very blessed that he wrote the book. I got to read it, even though it was a doozy. So
I think remind me of one little thing that not from this story, although he did sort of discuss it, but one thing that somebody once said to me when I started to write is that emotion is always what drives your story. The reader is going to connect with the characters in the book based on the emotions that they feel. So even if it's an action story, it's still the emotion of your characters that actually drive the story. If you don't go into the emotions of your characters, you're going to lose your readers very quickly. I think it's worth considering. Like, I think a lot of newbie writers don't think about the emotion enough.
Yeah, I've been thinking I have too much emotion in mine, but I have a couple beta readers that are keeping up with all my chapters and they like it. And I'm like, I think there can be too much. I think it can be melodramatic if you have too many emotions in a scene. So
it's also going to be
What do you mean? It can never be too dramatic.
Isn't that called overacting?
For our audio-only listeners here, Rita is doing the classical lean back, turn to forehead. All right, so I'm going to share my best tip that I learned, and it's the importance of meaningful choices for characters. And he emphasizes that, we make choices every day. And the example you use is, don't put into your book if your character's trying to figure out whether or not to use sugar in the coffee, because that is such a small choice. It's not meaningful. Characters have to make meaningful choices. And I think someone here mentioned this earlier, how we read, books sometimes to see how other people, their choices they make and what happens from that, especially if it's something similar to theirs. And he does hit on this idea that the best meaningful choices, or I don't know if he said best, I think he said the only meaningful choices are going to fall into one of these two categories. And that's the best bad choice or the irreconcilable goods choice. And best bad choice is when a character has to choose the least bad option from a set of undesirable choices. So example, the character is caught in an affair and they can choose between confessing and facing the consequences or lying and maybe getting away with it. So that's the best bad choice. And then the second one he says is the irreconcilable goods. And that's when a character must choose between two good options, knowing that one choice will mean giving up the benefits of the other. And the example he used for that was a new single father at a law firm has to decide between prioritizing his career or his family. He can't do both. So I don't think I've ever thought about, I know that my characters make critical choices all the time. I've never thought about the best bad choice and the irreconcilable goods. I've never thought about in this dichotomy. So I'm going to go back through it. Since I'm editing, I'm going to look at all these choices being made and if they're doing that. And I'm like, I had already come up with yeah, that's what she made that choice. That was the best of bad choices, So it's, I was like, but maybe I can play that knowing now that's exactly what's happening. I think now I can play that up a little bit more in the narrative. So yeah, I think that's one of the best tips I learned from it.
It does clarify some things and really makes you think more specifically about different elements of the story. And that's what I like. I didn't really necessarily hear anything or read anything new in the story. It was more that my understanding grew and, I just feel like I've just got a much deeper understanding of story.
Yeah, me too.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, that will bring us to the end. Thank you guys so much for reading this book with me and coming on and talking about it. I really appreciate the time you took to do that. All right, so for links for Rita, CATHARINA, and ADESHILE are in the show notes for the podcast and in the description box on YouTube. We'll be back on November 15th with another book review on Get Your Book Selling on Kickstarter by Russell P. Nolte and Monica Leonel. And I've talked about Kickstarters a lot on the podcast before. And of course, I talk about my Kickstarter. So this book makes sense to do next. And that will do it for us. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much to our incredible listeners and viewers for joining us on our exploration of everything self-publishing. We hope you found our podcast to be a treasure trove of insights and inspiration. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform or thanks on our YouTube episodes. Don't forget, you can catch all of our past episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and other major podcast platforms. Keep writing, keep publishing, and we'll see you next time.